Now we've got by far the most difficult question out the way, but we still got two more. After the 3 and 5 marker, you have a 12 marker. Now, I quite like the 12 marker because the mark scheme is pretty forgiving actually. The marks available are simply 12 AO4 marks. AO4 is the assessment objective for judgment. So you get more marks for being able to correctly judge how different the two interpretations are. Let me just read out the question here because I'm getting ahead of myself. So 12 marker will always ask you to tell the difference between two interpretations, judge how different they are on a specific topic, and explain why they might be different. So this question, interpretations B and C both focus on the position of women in Anglo-Saxon society. How far do they differ, and what might explain any differences? So I highly recommend going through this question with a highlighter. Firstly, highlighting what the question's about, the position of women in Anglo-Saxon society, and then going through the content and provenance and highlighting any information that jumps out at you. A frame that works quite well for this is one paragraph identifying difference in the content, so any quotes, what they tell you about your main takeaway about that interpretation. So does the interpretation say, oh, women had a great position in society, which means interpretation A clearly thinks women had more rights or women had more freedom, whereas interpretation C suggests this. Here's a quote that backs that up. And then after that, your second paragraph should be focused on provenance. Provenance are the bits in bold. These are almost like the working out behind the interpretation. Who has said it? When did they say this? Did they say this in a newspaper article, in a book, on a TV documentary? Is it an original primary source, a first-hand account? All these things are things you can mention in that provenance paragraph and use it to say how different are they. Is one a historian and therefore is more likely to have done more rigorous research, and the other one is a Norman monk who supports William, so perhaps it may almost be like propaganda, attempting to sell the Norman line, therefore they differ on that. Finally, remember the marks are AO4, judgment marks, so we need to have a small conclusion, couple of sentences at the end there, just summarising how far or how much these two sources differ, and just a little reason why you think that's the case. So a good example of how we're going to answer a question like this is on the next slide. And there you go. Have a read through that. You'll notice we've got a small introduction, a small conclusion. These are important as you're getting those AO4 marks, those judgment marks. Then in the middle of that sandwich, you've got the meat, which is a paragraph about the content, using quotes from interpretation B, interpretation C, and seeing how different they seem. And then the third paragraph, or the second paragraph really, discounting the introduction, is regarding the provenance, commenting on the fact that one of them is a historical fiction book, the other is a modern historian, and seeing how that's going to influence the interpretations. Take a minute to pause me and have a read through that answer, as it's a good model. And if you want even more structure, I find this sheet here can help a little bit with answering 12 markers. It might be worthwhile finding a 12 marker. I always find Maths Made Easy quite a good resource for this, or even using the 12 marker on the previous slide. Try and answer the 12 marker using the structure sheet, because it can be incredibly helpful in like practicing the routine of how you might answer the 12 marker. Remember, once again, that first paragraph on content, second paragraph on provenance. Now finally, after all that, you've now got to do the 20 marker. Now the 20 marker is fortunately quite familiar to some other questions you might have come across. It's quite familiar to the 18 marker in the Crown Punishment paper and the Viking expansion paper. And it's almost like a similar structure. You create your 4 paragraphs, small introduction, small conclusion. These can be 3 agree, 1 disagree, 2 agree, 2 disagree, 3 disagree, 1 agree. In each paragraph, you create your line of argument, you support using a specific detail, and you explain it with a second order concept, which is like almost like, what does that mean? What is that going to lead to? Furthermore, these sort of connectives you can use to build your argument, and then linking back to the question. So with that in mind, one big hint with this is to take your time checking and thinking which 20 marker you should pick, because this exam paper presents you with two 20 markers, much like the Crime and Punishment and the Viking expansion paper presents you with two 18 markers. So read through the two 20 markers and create a little plan in your exam booklet about what you would write about if you pick that question. So maybe do like a little agree, disagree, and see if you can get enough points to create 4 paragraphs. And if you can't do that for one of the 20 markers, perhaps you can for the other one, and you should pick that one. So for example, here, I've got 20 marker stating, in her blog, The Death of Edward the Confessor and the Conflicting Claims to the English Crown, Dr. Jessica Nelson argues that Edward himself should shoulder some of the blame for the succession crisis. How far do you agree with this view? And there I've made a little plan. Agree, well, Edward didn't name a successor publicly, and Edward didn't have an heir, so that's 2 agree paragraphs. And then disagreeing, we've got Harold Hardrada. He's an issue. It was outside the control of Edward the Confessor, as Harold's father Magnus was given his claim by someone completely unrelated. And then William and Normandy, now you could argue that, yes, he had a good, strong relationship with Edward, but without his drive, you could argue that the succession crisis would have never happened. So this here is giving us a rough framework of how we might answer that, and then we can go ahead to answer it. Now, before answering, we need to keep in mind that the mark scheme for this is 20 marks, not like the 18 markers, and it's easy to say it's identical, but it's not, okay? The 18 markers, the marks, AO1, 6 marks, AO2, 12 marks. The 20 mark is different. AO1, knowledge mark, 5 marks. AO2, explanation marks, 5 marks. AO4, judgment marks, 10 marks. That means as you're writing your response to this, you need to be constantly judging how correct or incorrect the person that is being targeted in the question is. So just make sure that whenever you're writing a paragraph in this exam, you're saying, oh, this means I agree or disagree with Dr. Nelson that Edward himself should shoulder some of the blame for the succession crisis. It even says in the mark scheme that you need to consistently refer to key words used in the question. So that's what you'll be doing in your linking back to the question part, and that is how you'll get your AO4 marks. So let's think about how we might plan a paragraph for this. So we've got a line of argument. Edward didn't name a successor publicly. Specific detail that you used to back that up. Edward named both Harold Godwinson and William heirs, supposedly, privately, but never let the public know who would be king. Explaining, linking to the question, this created uncertainty. Then once you've said that, you would say, therefore, I do agree with Dr. Nelson that Edward himself should shoulder some of the blame for the succession crisis. But let's see some of this in action. I've got a couple paragraphs here. I want you to think about where you can identify those 4 steps in the history answer checklist, but also try and identify where it has a letdown, because there certainly is one. So just have a read through that and try and identify where the 4 steps in the history answer checklist are. And here you go. I've went through and highlighted the 4 steps. So I'm just going to focus on that first paragraph after the introduction. It can be strongly argued that Edward the Confessor should shoulder some of the blame for the succession crisis because he failed to provide a clear and consistent plan for the succession causing the crisis. That's the line of argument. Edward had no children, yet he did not formally and publicly name a single heir whose claim was accepted by all major figures, leading to the inevitable scramble for power. At different points he appeared to support William of Normandy and later Harold Godwinson. Great specific detail there. Creating uncertainty and rival claims. This lack of clarity was a direct cause, second order concept, explanation, was a direct cause of the crisis after Edward's death in January 1066, and it allowed several powerful individuals to claim the throne as theirs. Now this is where I'm going to pause. You'll have noticed I've done something here between slides. In the last slide, it pretty blithely said, therefore I agree that Edward had a lot of indecision, he had a role in the confusion, and caused the conditions for the later conflict. However, this is not going to get a lot of those AO4 marks there. We have to remember half the marks in this 20 marker are judgment marks. And in the mark scheme, they specifically, explicitly say you need to refer to key terms in the question. So what I've done there is I've edited it. Therefore I agree, and I've got a quote, therefore I agree that Edward himself should shoulder some of the blame, as his indecision and subsequent confusion played a significant role in causing the conditions for later conflict. Brilliant. There you go. That will get AO4 marks because you're referring to the key terms using the question. And then in that second paragraph, once again, in that link back to the question right at the end, therefore there are reasons of power and religion that potentially show Edward himself should shoulder some of the blame. That's going to hoover up the AO4 marks. Remember, only 5 marks here are for knowledge. Only 5 marks are for the explanations in second order concept. Whereas the AO4, the judgment marks, how correct or incorrect the author is, that's 10 marks. So we really need to be hammering that home. Right, okay. Thank you for using this, and I hope it helps.